The Second World War was undoubtedly the largest, most destructive and bloodiest conflict in human history, leaving an indelible mark on every continent, including even distant Antarctica. Fighting erupted across the globe, from the fields of China and France to the exotic shores of Hawaii, icy Iceland, scorching Somalia, picturesque Sri Lanka, the harsh Arctic, and countless other regions. Warfare unfolded in trenches, on horseback, in the boundless skies, beneath ocean depths, and, for the first time in human history, even reached into outer space and involved nuclear weapons, forever transforming humanity's understanding of war. This global conflict radically reshaped the world order. Powerful European empires, British, French, Dutch, and others, never fully recovered from the blows they sustained. The remainder of the 20th century came to be dominated by two new superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, which dictated the geopolitical landscape for decades. In Asia, the war ultimately led to the triumph of the Chinese Communist Party, the dramatic division of Korea into two spheres of influence, and the birth of India as an independent nation. This raises several natural questions. When exactly did this monumental event take place? What were its key phases? And who were the main adversaries on the battlefields? Answering these questions is essential to understanding modern history. The precise start date of the Second World War depends on one's perspective. The conflict stemmed from deep-seated ambitions to expand empires, seize territory, assert dominance, accumulate wealth, and control resources. Three dictatorships, Germany, Italy, and Japan, collectively known as the Axis powers, aggressively expanded their domains throughout the 1930s. Germany saw dominance in Europe, Japan and China had already been locked in fierce combat since 1937, and some historians regard this as the true beginning of the war. The United States was effectively drawn into the war in the Pacific in December 1941, following Japan's surprise attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Thus, for Americans, the war began in 1941. However, Europeans, Canadians, Australians, Indians, and residents of other European colonies, which constituted the vast majority of the world's population at the time, marked the war's start in September 1939. That month, Adolf Hitler, Germany's dictator, invaded Poland. In response, numerous countries declared war on Germany, marking the official beginning of the Second World War in Europe. The war's end is somewhat clearer. Germany and Japan suffered crushing defeats and were occupied in 1945. But why is September 1939 so pivotal? In Europe, Hitler's Nazi Party had seized power in Germany, dismantling democratic institutions and establishing a totalitarian regime. Under his rule, political opponents, Jews, and other minorities were persecuted and concentration camps were built. Hitler's central goal was territorial expansion, specifically reclaiming lands lost after Germany's defeat in the First World War in 1918. In 1938, he annexed Austria and then seized parts of Czechoslovakia. Yet, his ambitions stretched far beyond. He dreamed of a vast Eastern Empire encompassing Ukraine's fertile farmland and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Claiming that Western Poland had historically belonged to Germany, Hitler targeted it next. To secure his eastern flank, he signed a non-aggression pact with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin in August 1939. Secretly, they agreed to invade and partition Poland between them. On September 1st, 1936 2.0, Hitler assumed Britain and France would tolerate this, as they had reluctantly accepted the annexation of Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia over the previous 2 years. But the invasion of Poland was the final straw. They declared war on Germany. Hitler was now embroiled in another world war. What now? He reportedly asked his foreign minister. Britain and France were soon joined by their vast empires: Canada, India, Nigeria, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and many others, all now drawn into the conflict. Events unfolded rapidly. Germany and the Soviet Union swiftly divided Poland. British and French forces offered little effective aid. A minor French incursion into Western Germany advanced only a few miles before retreating once victorious German troops returned from Poland. The Soviets fared poorly in their own invasion of Finland, suffering a humiliating setback, though they later seized a small portion of Finnish territory in 1940. At sea, German U-boats and warships targeted British shipping in what became known as the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign that lasted until the war's final days. Just hours after hostilities began, a German submarine sank the passenger liner Athenia. Meanwhile, any German naval vessel venturing into open waters was hunted down. The British Royal Navy famously sank the German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee off the coast of South America. On the European continent, however, a tense lull, dubbed the Phony War, prevailed. Both sides watched each other across the Franco-German border. In Britain, more civilians died in road accidents due to blackout conditions than soldiers did in combat. But this stalemate shattered in April 1940. Both the Allies and Germany moved to invade Norway to secure its vital resources, particularly iron ore and oil shipped through the port of Narvik. Germany swiftly overran Denmark in hours and launched a naval invasion of Norway, evading the British fleet partly thanks to poor weather. Allied attempts to reinforce Norwegian forces failed. By late May, the last Allied troops and the Norwegian royal family were evacuated. The defeat sparked political crisis in Britain, leading to the collapse of the government and the rise of a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill had barely assumed office when, on the very day he moved into 10 Downing Street, German forces launched a massive invasion of Western Europe. Huge German armies poured across the borders of Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. What followed was one of the most dramatic military collapses in history. Employing tanks, aircraft, and motorized units in a revolutionary tactic later dubbed Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, the Germans achieved a stunning breakthrough. While Allied forces advanced into Belgium, expecting a repeat of the static trench warfare of World War I, the Germans struck unexpectedly through the Ardennes forest, a region most strategists considered impassable for large armored formations. This surprise maneuver split the Allied armies in two. Within 10 days, German forces reached the English Channel, cutting off all northern Allied troops in Belgium from the main French army to the south. Trapped, British and French forces retreated to the coastal town of Dunkirk. In a desperate evacuation, the Royal Navy mobilized not only warships but also civilian vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, river barges, to rescue soldiers directly from the beaches, as port facilities had been heavily damaged. The British initially hoped to save 45,000 men over 2 days. But Hitler unexpectedly ordered his advancing panzers to halt, concerned about overextended supply lines and unsuitable marshy terrain near Dunkirk. In just 1 week, an astonishing 340,000 Allied troops were rescued, many calling it a miracle. Britain had saved its army, though it left behind nearly all its heavy equipment. Seizing the moment, Italy, Hitler's Axis partner, declared war and invaded southern France. After Dunkirk, German forces turned south and crushed the remaining French army. Within weeks, France fell. Hitler visited Paris for propaganda photographs. Germany now dominated Western and Central Europe. Inspired by Churchill's defiant speeches, Britain and its empire resolved never to surrender. Hitler now faced a British problem. He had to either force Britain into peace or destroy it entirely. Otherwise, the British would continue harassing him while he turned east to realize his ultimate ambition, conquering the Soviet Union and building a vast German empire. Hitler ordered preparations for an invasion of Britain while using the Luftwaffe to bomb the country into submission. Thus began the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought almost entirely in the air. German bombers initially targeted Royal Air Force, RAF, airfields and infrastructure, aiming to achieve air superiority before launching mass terror raids on cities. But the RAF proved remarkably resilient. Hurricanes and Spitfires fiercely contested every raid. German bomber losses mounted to unsustainable levels. The British employed a pioneering radar system to detect incoming raids and direct fighter squadrons with unprecedented efficiency. As summer wore on, the RAF seemed invincible. Frustrated, the Germans shifted tactics in early September, bombing London in hopes of breaking civilian morale. This marked the start of the Blitz, sustained aerial bombing of British cities. Yet by mid-September, it was clear the Luftwaffe had failed. The RAF remained a potent force, and the cost of bombing London was too high. Hitler admitted he, without neutralizing the RAF and the Royal Navy ready to annihilate any invasion fleet, he shelved plans for a cross-channel invasion. Night bombing of cities continued, but Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. While Britain fought for survival at home, it also battled Italian forces in the Mediterranean, where colonial territories clashed in North and East Africa. British forces successfully liberated Italian-occupied Ethiopia, but fighting in Libya and Egypt proved far more grueling and prolonged. 1941 became a decisive year as Axis and British forces clashed with increasing intensity in North Africa. Meanwhile, Italy's ill-fated invasion of Greece in late 1940 collapsed into humiliating retreats, forcing Mussolini to beg Hitler for help. The Führer could not let his allies' failure tarnish the Axis image, so he invaded the Balkans, swiftly occupying Yugoslavia and Greece by April 1941. But this diversion cost the Axis precious time and resources, just as they were preparing for their most ambitious operation yet, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Hitler shocked his former ally Stalin by launching Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Nearly 4 million Axis troops, 3,500 tanks, over 8,000 vehicles, thousands of aircraft, and more than 500,000 horses surged across the Soviet frontier. The Red Army was caught completely off guard. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Most prisoners perished in horrific conditions. Even Stalin's own son died in German captivity. By December, German spearheads stood on the outskirts of Moscow. But fierce Soviet resistance and the brutal Russian winter halted the advance. The Soviets then launched a powerful counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from the capital. Hitler had believed that by kicking in the door, the entire rotten structure. Instead, Soviet forces retreated but did not break, setting the stage for a protracted and catastrophic war of attrition. As German troops closed in on Stalin's capital, a sudden attack erupted on the other side of the world. Japan, locked in a war with China and desperate for victory, urgently needed raw materials such as rubber and oil, which were abundant in Southeast Asia, particularly in places like Malaya. Japanese military planners anticipated that the United States would oppose any invasion of these territories. Consequently, they decided to launch a preemptive strike to neutralize the US Pacific Fleet, thereby securing a free hand to seize the resources they coveted. In early December 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed toward the Hawaiian Islands. On December 7, 1941, they launched their attack. Bombs and torpedoes rained down on the US at Meta, quote, pause quote, colon, quote, sex, quote, colon, 2.0, Pacific Fleet, headquarters at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, and 2,500 Americans lost their lives. President Roosevelt called the day a date which will live in infamy, and declared war on Japan. Remarkably, Adolf Hitler then declared war on the United States. America thus entered the conflict against both Japan and Germany, merging the wars in Europe and Asia into a truly global conflagration. Simultaneously with the Pearl Harbor assault, Japanese forces invaded British-controlled Malaya, followed by Indonesia and the Philippines. Within months, all these territories had fallen under Japanese control. The year 1942 proved pivotal. It began with Axis advances, but ended in devastating defeats. Japan expanded its reach across Asia and the Pacific, capturing Burma, advancing toward India's borders, and even bombing Australia and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, German and Axis forces surged through Ukraine into southern Russia, reaching. However, their offensive stalled amid brutal urban combat as they struggled to secure the city. That same summer, Japan suffered a catastrophic naval defeat. Having broken Japanese naval codes, the Americans laid a trap near Midway Island. US carrier-based dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, delivering a crippling blow to the core of Japan's naval power. The tide of war had turned. A similar shift occurred in North Africa. After a dramatic Axis advance deep into Egypt threatened Britain's entire Middle Eastern position, British forces counterattacked at El Alamein in October and pushed the Axis back, a turning point that began a long retreat. Days later, American troops made their first appearance in the European theater, joining British forces in landings in Morocco and Algeria. This move threatened to trap Axis forces between the advancing British army from Egypt and the new Allied front in the west. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive against the Germans at Stalingrad. Within days, the German Sixth Army was encircled. Despite desperate resistance, the last remnants surrendered in February 1943, a crushing defeat for Nazi Germany. In 1943, the Allies intensified their aerial campaign over Europe. Night after night, fleets of bombers struck German cities and industrial centers. In a daring May raid, British bombers breached key dams in the Ruhr Valley, disrupting hydroelectric power and water supplies in Germany's industrial heartland. On the Eastern Front, Germany launched its final major offensive near Kursk. However, British intelligence, having decrypted German communications, provided Stalin with detailed intelligence. The Soviets constructed formidable defensive lines that inflicted horrific losses on the attackers before launching a powerful counteroffensive that in the Atlantic, Allied navies, British, American, Canadian, and others, developed effective tactics to counter the U-boat threat. In a series of decisive engagements, they sank German submarines in such numbers that German admirals suspended all submarine operations. The U-boats would never regain the upper hand. By spring 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. In July, the Allies invaded Sicily, the first foothold on Axis home territory. Later that month, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was deposed and arrested. In early September, Allied forces landed on mainland Italy. Although Italy agreed to surrender, German troops swiftly took control of the country, forcing the Allies into a grueling, slow advance up the Italian peninsula. In the Pacific, the United States shifted to the offensive, executing a two-pronged, island-hopping campaign. One thrust moved through the South Pacific, securing New Guinea and nearby islands. The other advanced through the Central Pacific, capturing the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The Axis was in full retreat. Victory was no longer within their grasp. As Germany's situation deteriorated, its genocidal campaign against European Jews and other targeted groups accelerated. Millions were murdered in industrialized death camps across the shrinking Nazi empire. By 1944, the noose tightened around the Axis powers. The Soviet Union launched a series of massive offensives involving millions of soldiers, steadily driving Axis forces westward through brutal, large-scale battles. By year's end, Soviet troops had crossed into Germany itself. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the US inflicted successive defeats on Japan. Much of its navy was destroyed in major sea battles like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. American forces methodically seized key islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, establishing air bases from which long-range bombers could strike the Japanese. In a desperate and largely ineffective measure, Japan launched incendiary balloons toward North America. One such device killed 6 civilians in Oregon, the only US mainland casualties of Axis action during the war. Japanese forces also attempted an invasion of India, but were decisively halted at the battles of Kohima and Imphal and forced into retreat. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, American, British, Canadian, and Allied forces launched the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe. Within 24 hours, some 150,000 troops landed in Normandy. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, while the bulk crossed the English Channel in over 7,000 vessels to storm the beaches. Fierce resistance from German defenders in fortified bunkers made progress agonizingly slow on some sectors, but by day's end, the Allies had secured a foothold. Over the following days, vast quantities of troops and equipment poured ashore. German reinforcements rushed to Normandy, triggering a brutal battle of attrition. Not until early August did the Allies break out decisively, sweeping across northern France and liberating Paris by month's end. Victory seemed imminent. The Allies then attempted an ambitious airborne operation to seize bridges over the Rhine at Arnhem, but the Germans, though weakened, fought back fiercely and thwarted the plan. The war dragged into another horrific winter. In December, Hitler launched his last major offensive through the snow-covered Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Though the attack created a bulge in Allied lines, it failed to achieve a breakthrough. Reinforcements flooded the region, and the Battle of the Bulge ended in yet another German defeat, one that cost them irreplaceable troops, tanks, and fuel. All these events culminated in 1945. Yet the Axis powers fought on to the bitter end, inflicting immense, unnecessary... When the snows melted in spring, Allied forces surged through northern Italy, completing its liberation. On the Western Front, retreating Germans blew up one of their largest dams to flood the countryside and slow the Allied advance. But by March, Western forces had crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into Germany. By April, they stood just 50 miles from Berlin. In the east, the Soviets advanced relentlessly through Poland and eastern Germany. With nearly 2.5 million troops, they overwhelmed German defenses. Stalin, desperate to reach Berlin before the Western Allies, urged his generals forward, and they succeeded. By late April, Berlin was encircled. On 30 April, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun, then killed her and committed suicide. Admiral Karl Dönitz, his short-lived successor as Führer, surrendered unconditionally on May 7th. The war in Europe was over. Some 43 million people had perished. 2/3 of Europe's Jews had been exterminated. Cities lay in ruins, cultural treasures destroyed, and the continent was left shattered. Japan, however, continued to resist. Its cities burned, its empire in ruins. American forces drew ever closer to the home islands. After horrific battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders employed suicidal but futile tactics, plans were drawn up for a full-scale invasion of Japan itself. But then, the United States stunned the world. A single aircraft dropped the most powerful weapon ever created, the atomic bomb. This wonder weapon was the product of a massive, secret American scientific and industrial effort, the Manhattan Project, to harness atomic energy. A successful test in July 1945 turned a stretch of New Mexico desert into glass. In August, President Harry S. Truman, having assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April, authorized the use of the bomb to... On the 6th of August, Hiroshima was obliterated. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Hundreds of thousands were killed or grievously wounded. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union finally entered the Pacific War. The day after Hiroshima, Stalin launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Faced with overwhelming force on two fronts, the Japanese government capitulated. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd, 1945, aboard an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. World War II was over. The world that emerged was irrevocably transformed. In Europe, Eastern territories fell under Soviet communist control, redrawing the geopolitical map. Germany, once Europe's powerhouse, was split. The East occupied by the Soviet Union, the West by Western democracies. The United States, now a nuclear superpower, assumed global dominance, eclipsing the war-exhausted British and French empires. In Asia, Japan underwent sweeping reconstruction under American occupation. Korea, like Germany, was divided, the South aligned with democracies, the North under communist rule. Vietnam, having shaken off French colonial authority during the war, entered a new phase of conflict as France attempted to reassert control. China, ravaged by years of warfare, became the stage for a renewed civil war, which by 1949 resulted in communist forces taking control of the mainland. We still live in a world profoundly shaped by the consequences of World War II. Its echoes continue to resonate through the politics, borders, and alliances of our time.